Can you give a brief history of SpaceX rockets? So we got Falcon 1, Falcon 9. There's different versions of those, Falcon Heavy, Starship, and also the Dragon capsules and so on.
Well, Falcon 1 is where it all started. The original intent and the original idea of SpaceX was Elon wanted to try to get something to Mars. He saw that NASA didn't have a current Mars plan, and he wanted to go to Mars. So he decided, how do I best do this? He literally wanted to, at first, purchase a rocket from Russia. Then after a foiled attempt at doing that, he decided he was going to try to develop his own rocket. And the Falcon 1 is what came out of that process. And he developed a pretty incredible team. Like, I don't know how exactly he stumbled upon the team that he stumbled upon that quickly, but the people that he assembled were amazing. And they built the Falcon 1, which was a single Merlin engine, followed by an upper stage engine called the Kestrel engine. Pretty small compared to the things they're working on today, but that Merlin engine continued to evolve into being the power plant for the Falcon 9. They went from a small lift launch vehicle up into the medium class launch vehicle so they could provide services for NASA. That's one of the big things they first kind of hung their hat up, was they got the opportunity to fly cargo to the International Space Station under, originally it was called the COTS program, the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services for NASA, which evolved into the commercial resupply contracts. And that's when SpaceX developed both their Dragon capsule, which is a uncrewed at first spacecraft that can dock to the ISS, and the Falcon 9 rocket that can take it to the International Space Station. And
the Dragon rides on, it's a thing up top that rides on the big booster thing that launches it into orbit.
Exactly. Yep. So the Falcon 9's the semi-truck, the Dragon capsule is the payload. It's the thing being dropped off basically at its destination. And in this case, the destination is the International Space Station. So they developed those relatively quickly and became a commercial success. Before you know it, they're now the number one launch provider in the world, launching more mass to orbit than anybody else, launching more frequently than countries, like the entire country of China, who's going crazy right now with launches. Granted, China beat them by 2 launches in 2022, but prior year, SpaceX beat the entire country of China. I mean, it's nuts.
And just like you said, SpaceX still beats China even this year in terms of the amount of payload that was done. So all
the mass to orbit.
The mass to orbit, right? That China had like 60 something, a couple more launches, but there was just like small CubeSat type of launches.
Exactly. Some of them were literally like 100 kilograms or something, like not large payloads.
And so SpaceX customers are different. So whoever wants to send payloads up into space.
Yes, but right now their biggest customer is actually themselves with Starlink. One of the biggest reasons they've launched so much mass to orbit is because Starlink is designed around the payload fairing and the payload capabilities of the Falcon 9 rocket. So, because they're vertically integrated, because they build their own satellites, because they're building their own rocket, they can literally design a system that's, another manufacturer might have made a more square satellite that was heavier or something, but SpaceX looked at it from a blank slate and said, here's our constraints, our payload mass constraints, our volume constraints. And they made a funky looking satellite. Things like the size of it's like a table folded up, which isn't anything I've, really ever seen before. So, but it's purpose built to fit as efficiently as possible inside their fairing and inside the capabilities of that rocket. So therefore, because they're launching those like an insane amount, dozens, 40, 50 times a year or whatever, they're just putting up insane amounts of mass like we've never seen before.
What about the different versions of Falcon 9, so we can linger on them? What are some interesting memories to you of the different developments in Falcon 9?
The very first Falcon 9s had a square array of engines. It had like a 3x3x3 grid of their Merlin 1 engines, the 1Ds. And I think it only lasted, I don't remember if it was 2 or 4 flights before they went into this octaweb configuration where there's 8, like a ring of 8 engines with a center engine in the middle. Still in the same diameter. The rocket the fuselage was more or less the same, 3.7 meter wide diameter, but the actual thrust structure changed. And one of the big efficiency gains was you no longer have, a corner engine and then like a edge engine and then another corner engine. You can just make 8 of the same, kind of part of the octaweb, it's called, the same shape. And then your interchangeability and your manufacturability becomes a lot simpler. So that was kind of one of the bigger upgrades at first. And they kept stretching it. Every time they like touched this thing, it got longer and like, or taller technically. And then the next big feature that you saw in 2014 would have been they added landing legs to a Falcon 9 rocket, which was, that was the first launch I ever went to, was actually to see, it was CRS-3, so Commercial Resupply Mission 3. And it was probably I don't remember what that was, like their 14th or 15th launch or something, like pretty early on. And people were literally laughing at the idea of them putting landing legs on it. They just thought it was stupid. They're like, why is this billionaire Elon Musk guy wasting his time trying to land a rocket? It's not going to work.
So you said the Mars planet was there in the beginning. What about the reusability of rockets? Was that there in the beginning?
I think reusability definitely, it's a necessary part of making any kind of interplanetary mission. In order to actually do that, just financially, you have to start reusing these things.
In terms of the development of the Falcon 1 and Falcon 9, how early on did the goal of reusing the rocket, having the rocket actually land, how early did that goal creep in?
I can't speak for Elon and SpaceX, but it was pretty, immediate that they wanted to try to recover. And as a matter of fact, I think the very first two Falcon 9 rockets and Falcon 1, I think they even wanted to try to recover using parachutes to recover the first stage. And now fast forward, almost 20 years later, and Rocket Lab's actually doing a concept like that, where they're pulling a parachute after the first stage is re-entering, and they actually are trying to recover it with a helicopter. It's going to try to snatch it out of the air. They've actually done it. They've actually done it successfully once.
How does the helicopter grab the rocket?
With this giant like drag line and a hook.
Oh,
and then it literally just like snags onto the parachute.
Wow.
And it's pretty amazing. But this is a small rocket. Their rocket's only about a metric ton. The booster is empty.
So the rocket releases parachutes.
Yep.
Like really high up. I'd love to see this.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. There's so many interesting ideas and possibilities. Like SpaceX basically just innovated a lot of different weird ideas just in the pursuit of making things more efficient, reusable, all of that. So basically thinking from first principles how to solve this problem. And so what you find is like you'll get all these kind of crazy kind of solutions.
And with SpaceX, they weren't even getting to the point of the booster surviving re-entry long enough to be able to pull the parachutes.
Yeah.
Their mass fractions, and that varies. Every single rocket's different. All the, for instance, Rocket Lab uses carbon composite fuselage and tanks, or, same thing. And that's very, very lightweight, has really good mass fractions, and therefore their drag coefficients and things like that, they were able to survive re-entry of the first stage, which is something that SpaceX wasn't able to do at the time. What the kind of the big, I think, breakthrough for SpaceX with reusing the booster is they realized we have to basically slow down before we hit the atmosphere. So they actually do what they used to call a re-entry burn, which I still think is the correct term because it is re-entering the atmosphere, but now they call it the entry burn. And they light up 3 of the 9 Merlin engines, not only to slow it down, but actually even while those engines are firing, it creates like a literal like force field as it's falling through the atmosphere.
Oh, interesting.
And but it also decreases the velocity by almost half, or around half, and then that therefore decreases the amount of, the biggest thing with the atmosphere is that as it gets compressed against the front of anything flying through the atmosphere, the compressed atoms just get hot, and they can get so hot they turn into a plasma, and they get so hot they can just absolutely destroy anything. So they slow down enough that the air molecules don't end up, destroying the vehicle on reentry. And then they realized, I think at some point it's probably a similar crossover. They're like, well, if we're lighting the engines already to slow down in the atmosphere, we can just use that same engine to land. Mm-hmm. And so like, well, what if we just stuck landing legs on it and just landed the thing vertically? And next thing you know is December 21st, 2015, they did exactly that for the first time. They landed.
So you were there before that then, right?
Yeah. Yep.
In 2014.
Yep. Early 2014. So and for me, like that was so fun watching, that was like the peak of me just becoming obsessed with this idea. I'm watching and back in the day, it was like months between launches, so a launch was like a big idea. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to watch this landing attempt or whatever, and there's CRS-4, almost landed, CRS-5, almost landed, CRS-6, CRS-7 blew up. I was watching that on, I think it was like a Saturday morning or maybe a Sunday morning. And I remember watching that and watched it blow up. And I was like, oh my God, now what, and It blew up on ascent. It was their first failure. So it was their 18th flight, I believe. CRS-7, the upper stage, had one of the there's bottles inside the tanks that are filled with helium, and one of those bottles broke off on ascent and actually just completely overpressured the upper stage, and the upper stage blew up, and the whole rocket went kaboom in an uncontrolled manner. And so then they came back with vengeance. When they came back, the first mission back is the first time that they landed a rocket, which was awesome. So the return to flight after the anomaly was landing a rocket.
And stuck the landing.
Yep.
Well, actually, the first time. So the first time you were there, what was that like? What do you remember from that day?
Just, I was surprised at how much bigger the rocket was than I imagined. I originally, when I was going down to Kennedy Space Center, I was disappointed that I wasn't seeing like I didn't know a ton about rockets. I knew enough to like know what a space shuttle was, what like the Saturn V was, but that was probably about the end of my knowledge. I just remember being disappointed that I wasn't seeing a big quote unquote NASA rocket flying. I was thinking in my head like, oh, I'm going to see this launch. It's probably going to be like, 3 stories tall or something, just some little skinny little stick and some little firecracker and yay, and I think I'd almost been pitched that too. I think the people that I was working for at the time, I think they kind of were downplaying it as like, well, it's not a big rocket, so it's not going to be that exciting, But we get out there to the pad, and I'm like, this thing's huge. This is not a small rocket. Like it's 70 meters tall, 220 feet tall. It's huge. And I think people forget like the scale of that. It might look skinny and tall and all this stuff, but it's still a very, very large piece of machinery. It's physically about as large as you can ship. The booster is about as big as you can ship across the country, period, without like completely shutting down highways. It is made within those exact specifications of like having, lane privileges and bridges and everything. It's, 12 feet wide, 3.7 meters wide, and it's 45 meters long. So it's like exactly what you can fit with a pretty standard, like before we start getting into crazy amounts of problems shipping the rocket. And it's huge. It's huge. And people just don't understand that. And so when I saw it with my own eyes, I remember just being like, this is so much cooler than I thought.
Is it hard to believe that thing is going to have to lift off the ground and launch up into the air? Maybe that's the most humbling aspect of it. That something that size, humans have come up with a way to take something that size and launch it up into the air.
Yeah, there's certainly a very humbling aspect when you watch it actually leave. And
was there a sound to it? Was there like a feeling? What are the different experiences that you first remember?
Well, ironically, I didn't end up getting to see that one fly.
Oh,
I went home. My camera saw it. I left my camera out there, like a remote triggered camera. My first images as a launch photographer at the time was CRS-3, but I went home. It scrubbed too many times. Now, this is back in the day. They were scrubbing like often, and there'd be like a 3-day, 5-day, 7-day. You just never knew. So I go home and I watched the live stream of it. So I didn't even get to experience my first launch. And anyone that's ever tried to go to a launch can probably empathize because scrubs are very common in the spaceflight world. So that one I didn't get to see. But since then, obviously, I've been able to attend very many launches.
How much do you understand the control involved in the landing? How difficult is that problem?
I couldn't tell you a single thing about like the code and like the avionics behind it, but I can tell you all the hardware that makes it happen, if that helps.
Well, to me, it seems like whenever I talk to people, they say it's not that big of a deal in terms of the level of intelligence in the control. But to me, it's just like when you observe it, it seems incredible because of all the variables involved, all the uncertainties involved, all the because there's aerodynamics. I mean, like there's different temperatures. There's so much going on with the fuel, the burning, the combustion, just everything that's going on to be able to perform control at such high stakes effectively. Like, that code is probably not written in JavaScript, I guess is what I'm saying. Anyway.
Actually, no, I don't. If I remember, again, this is well outside of my domain. But they're coded in a common language. It's
probably going to be C.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. And that was one of the things that was weird is that Elon, when he started SpaceX, was like, we're just going to code in the most common language so that we don't have to like have people learn this archaic, weird thing, and we can just literally pull people off the streets and be like, here, write it, and
it's probably C++. I mean, it'd be epic if it was like Python or something, but I think like reliable systems have to be written in C++ probably, which is a common language, which is something I imagine like NASA engineers would probably have to use some kind of proprietary language in the olden days for security, for privacy, all that kind of stuff.
Well, in the old days, like
Yeah,
they were inventing code and language from scratch. For sure.
But still, it's just still incredible that it's able to do that. Like, just the feat of engineering involved is just it's truly. It's like one of the marvels to observe about these rockets coming back to Earth, that they're able to land. Like, the drama of it is just incredible to see.
Yeah, well, the one of the fun things to remember too, with specifically with the Falcon 9 and the Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy boosters. I mean, it's the same thing basically. They shut down all but one of the 9 engines, and even with that one engine at its minimum throttle setting, it's still too much thrust to hover. So as this rocket's coming down, if they start a little bit too early, if they light that engine too early, it will actually stop above the ground and will not be able to lower itself. It will literally stop, like, say it stopped 200 feet above the ground. Their only option is to kill the engine, and then it's just going to fall those 200 feet. So it's what we call like a suicide burn or a hover slam, kind of interchangeable terms, because your thrust to weight ratio is never below 1. Yeah. So they have to actually literally be riding the throttle. So what you do is you kind of start, ideally, you kind of start like in the middle of your window of throttle range. So let's pretend your engine can throttle down to 40% of its maximum rated thrust. You might start at like 70% of thrust in the middle of that like window of where it could burn. So if all of a sudden it's kind of coming in too hot, you have room to throttle up. If you're coming into, you're actually, a little too early, you throttle it down. You have a little bit of wiggle room. And it's just amazing how smoothly and how perfectly they're able to still control that thing, even though they're down to one engine out of the 9, and they're still riding like the finest margin of what's possible. And they're continually playing with that to try to get it, because every bit of fuel they're using and propellant they're using to land is propellant they weren't using to put something into space. Yeah. So they want that to be as efficient as possible. So they're really like watching them hone that in and just continue to evolve and edit that and just get it to be the workhorse. We're coming up on 100 consecutive landings. Perfect landings, 100. I think they've done like 150 something landings altogether, 160 altogether. But we're talking like in a row without blowing up, which at the 5 years ago was completely experimental and insane. And now we're coming up to the point where we're 100 in a row. It's like this is becoming more reliable in the landing, which is not the primary mission. This is purely for SpaceX's like gain, is to recover the booster. It has nothing to do with the effect of getting the payload on orbit, most of the time. And the landing is really only for their benefit and their gain.
Long-term gain. Like, it's a long-term investment in being able to recover the boosters.
100%.
Can you believe all this was done in basically 10 years? So we've seen this development over a period of 10 years.
Oh, man.
So like where we started commercial space flight at scale to today, where it's almost starting to be mundane.
Yeah.
What Falcon 9 is able to do.
Yeah. I can't really believe it. I mean, obviously, even just in I think I'm a fairly fair weather fan, really didn't start paying attention until like 2014.
Yeah.
And just seeing what it was like back then to what it's like. I don't watch every launch at all anymore. Like, I'll catch the big ones. Yeah. I'll stream some of the really big ones. But like back in the day, like I said, would wake up in the middle of the night to catch these streams or, catch these launches and watch them because they were such a big deal. And there's maybe only 5 of them a year, And so it's a really big deal. Nowadays, it's like, oh yeah, there's literally like 2 a week on average now. It's insane. From SpaceX alone, let alone, United Launch Alliance, Rocket Lab, any of the Chinese missions, I mean, there's countless. It's insane. It's really, really, really hard to keep up with.
I wonder at which point in the future the number of launches to orbit will exceed the number of launches of airplanes like on the surface of Earth.
Yeah, I have to admit, I kind of have a hard time extrapolating out that far. There's a lot of people that are like big futurists and really do think about like interplanetary stuff and think about colonizing Mars and stuff. I have a hard time predicting like when Starship's going to fly, the orbital launch, and that's like imminent-ish, like month or 2 scale time frame. And yet I'm still like, I can't tell you when I can't tell you anything about like when we're going to land on Mars or what that economy and what that, the scale of launch operations is going to look like in order to do that, because it's just so hard I wouldn't have predicted where we're at today 5 years ago, it's insane. It's so hard to predict. And yeah, but it's funny because there's so many like new companies starting up trying to predict that. And it's a really exciting, startup culture right now.
I think when you make certain engineering decisions and hiring decisions and like what you focus on in terms of both business and engineering, it's good to think on the scale of 10, 20, 50, 100 years. That's one of the things that Elon is exceptionally good at, which is asking the question, okay, this might seem impossible right now, but what's the obvious way to do this if we look out 20 years? And then you start to make decisions. You start to make decisions about robotics, about brain and computer interfaces, about space travel. They make a lot of sense when you look at the scale of 10, 20, 50, 100 years, and don't make any sense if you look at the scale of just months. So, but of course, the actual work of day to day is focused on the next few months because there's deadlines, there's missions they have to accomplish. Anyway, we returning back to the brief history of SpaceX rockets. The Falcon Heavy. So what else is there? So we talked about Falcon 9 and the rapid development there. Yeah. What other flavors of Falcon is there, and how does that take us to Starship?
Yeah, realistically, the Falcon 9 evolved more or less, kind of like just got more powerful and a little bit longer and more capable. But nowadays they fly what's called the Block 5, even though it's like the 8th or 9th iteration of the of the Falcon 9, but they call it Block 5. It's the one that has the black landing legs, the black inner stage. They have a fleet of roughly 10 or so that are doing the majority of the legwork these days. And they're flying, up to 15 times, I think right now is the current booster leader. They're also recovering the fairings, so the nose cone of the rockets are frequently, if not every time, being recovered. Same with the booster for the most part. And the only thing being expended is the upper stage. And that's kind of where the Falcon 9 is ending. It really doesn't make sense to develop that infrastructure any longer. So they went with the next step, which is go even bigger physically. So they have more margin for upper stage reusability. And that's what we see with Starship and Super Heavy. So the Super Heavy booster, the whole system is confusing. The whole system's kind of considered Starship, but technically the Starship is just the upper stage, which is also like the spaceship, which is also the upper stage. Mm-hmm. And then the booster itself is considered the Super Heavy booster. And that's what they've been working on. Publicly, it came out in 2016 as at the time it was the ITS, the Interplanetary Transportation System. Later, and I think by the end of that year, 2017, it kind of became known as the BFR, the big Falcon rocket.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I think it was about end of 2018, they started calling it Starship. But that is where we're at today, and that's what they're working full steam ahead on.
And what about Dragon? We mentioned Dragon, Crew Dragon, Cargo Dragon.
Yeah. So they went from the cargo version of Dragon that flew about 20 times successfully to the International Space Station, except for that one CRS-7 where the rocket blew up in the capsule. Obviously didn't make it to the ISS. Then they went into the Dragon 2, which has two variants. It has a crew variant, so we just call it Crew Dragon. And then there's the cargo version of Dragon 2. And that's just an updated, sleeker, sexier version of Dragon. And it's, ironically, it's heavier altogether. So you'll never see those cool return to launch site landing, the boosters coming back to land for CRS missions anymore like we used to. But they landed on the drone ship anyway. And yeah, that's been flying successfully. That's kind of there's Starlink, Dragon, Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, and Starship system is kind of the whole SpaceX world, really.
In terms of the spaceships involved. So what to you are some of the major milestones in that history? We kind of mentioned a few.
Yeah.
Sticking the landing. Is there something that kind of stands out?
Yeah, I would say definitely the big ones, obviously, like any of the first, like the first flight of Falcon 1, first flight of Falcon 9, first time they went to the International Space Station, the first time they landed a booster, the first time they reused a booster, which is, I think, about 6 months after. No, it was a year after. It was SES-10, 2017. It was the first time they reused one of those boosters, and that was a big milestone. Like, can we even, we recovered one, we caught one, it's like, we got one, now what? Mm-hmm. That was the first time they reflew one. Then flying humans was a huge one. DM2, Bob and Doug, for NASA.
Bob and Doug, yeah.
Bob and Doug, that was incredible. That was a huge step, I think, for SpaceX, was flying people.
So it's first major commercial launching of humans out into space.
Yeah, and not just into space, because there's been people that have done space flights with like suborbital hops, but going into orbit, and especially docking and rendezvousing with the International Space Station it's a big deal. It's a whole. Until you really understand the physics involved and the scale involved of like just crossing the Kármán line, going straight up versus going into orbit, like they're just completely different things almost.
What about Starship? are we in a place where we can talk about milestones with Starship? Has there been, or has it just been an epic journey of failure and successes of testing and so on? Was there like what would you classify at this point as a milestone that Starship or BFR or whatever the name is was able to achieve?
Well, so far the milestones we've seen, I'd say the first one would be the hop of, they call it Starhopper, and it's basically a very rudimentary rocket. But it was the first time they utilized their new Raptor engine to produce thrust to fly something. It first flew like literally like 3 meters off the ground or something, like tethered to the ground. Then it flew like 15, and then finally it flew 150 meters. And that was in 2019. And that was the first big milestone of Starship. And then after that, we saw SN5, SN6 kind of do the similar like 150 meter hops with a little bit more elegant systems, proving out more of their tank building, proving out more of their, a lot of just subsystems. And then the big ones physically were in end of 2020 and early 2021 when they flew the SN8, 9, 10, 11, and 15.
What does the N stand for in SN?
I think just serial number or starship number.
Just number. SN, these are just names, numbers, numerical representations of the different testing efforts. They skip some numbers, right?
Yeah.
If they scratch a test.
Yeah, and lots of times it'd be like literally they're building, because at Starbase and what SpaceX is working on, like the one foot is always in front of someone else's foot, and like the arm is not knowing what the leg is doing sometimes.
Yeah.
They will have someone working on, they'll just be like, hurry up and build 40 of these tank sections, and you build the bulkhead, and you build the downcomer, and you build the header tank, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, like, oh, we actually evolved that. We don't use that header tank now. So it's going to go on to this one. So they'll have like parts of certain rockets built, and it's like, literally scrap it. Like not scrap it like in the, joke term, but like literally just go scrap it. And they just evolve and iterate so quickly.
There were some epic explosions. I think Starship, something about it, probably just the amount of fuel, just leads to some epic failures.
Oh yeah.
Probably. Yeah. Would you say Starship is the source of the most epic failures in terms of size of explosion?
So you can literally measure it in like a yield of explosive power, like you could TNT. You can take a look at how much propellant is left over at the time of the explosion. And Starship, what's flown so far, even though it's physically one of the largest flying objects ever, just with the upper stage alone, they've not filled it more than like 10 or 20% full of propellant.
Yeah.
And so it actually hasn't been, the failures have been really epic looking, big visual fireballs. But in terms of spaceflight, they're still pretty small explosions, believe it or not.
They could still go bigger.
Oh, yeah. A lot.
And of course, the test payload of a Tesla Roadster was launched. I forget what year that was.
Yeah, that's 2018.
That was quite epic. Would you put that on a milestone?
Oh, yeah. Falcon Heavy demo was like definitely a big milestone. Yeah.
Is that funny to you that there's a Roadster floating out there?
Yeah.
Do we know the location of that Roadster at this point?
Oh, yeah. Where is roadster.com?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is it orbiting something?
Yeah, it's orbiting the sun. So it's orbiting the sun. And its orbit is basically between the Earth's orbit and beyond Mars. So I think of like 2.5 AU, if I remember right. So it's beyond Mars's orbit at its highest point, and it's back at Earth, kind of at its lowest point.
I wonder if there's a mission where you're going to somehow connect with it once again and like place extra things into it. I wonder how challenging that is technically.
Oh yeah, it could absolutely be done. The hard thing at this point, because it's on an eccentric orbit, would be rendezvousing with it, because you kind of have to be in alignment with its orbit to really line up well with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, someday I don't see any reason why we couldn't at least send for sure an uncrewed, if Elon wanted to just fly a robot out there to check up on it and photograph it or something, like that could be well within the realm of things.
Get an Optimus robot up there. So that was the story brilliantly told by you of the rockets for SpaceX. What about through the lens of engines? Can you give a brief history of the SpaceX rocket engines that were used that we haven't covered? So you mentioned all started with the Merlin engine and a Kestrel engine. What, through that lens,
yeah,
what's there?
Engines are relatively small number, which is easy for us. There's the Merlin, and Merlin's evolved throughout time to be from like the Merlin to the Merlin 1C to the Merlin 1D to the Merlin 1D full thrust and all these other kind of tweaks of the same architecture. Kestrel ended with Falcon 1. They also have the Merlin vacuum engine, which is the upper stage engine for Falcon 9. Same relative system, but just optimized for vacuum, so it has a much larger bell nozzle. There's the Draco thrusters, which you kind of can consider engines. Well, they are rocket engines, but they're just small. They're not like the orbital engines. There's the Super Draco engines, which are the abort thrusters on Crew Dragon capsule. And then nowadays they have the Raptor engine and the Raptor vacuum variant. But they've already had two versions of Raptor. We've already seen kind of the Raptor development engine. We've kind of seen like a Raptor 1.5, where it's kind of taking hints of the future Raptor, but now we're well within what you'd consider a Raptor 2 variant. And that's really it.
Yeah, for the Raptor, maybe I'll ask you that separately. But I like in general, and people, who doesn't know who Everyday Astronaut is? But if you don't somehow know, go check your YouTube channel out. You're an incredible educator about the super technical and the more sort of even the philosophical, the actual the actual space travel. So you go down to the raw details of it, and there's just great videos on the Raptor engine. I think you have one on Merlin, and also actual tours with Elon where he discusses some of those things. On one of the tours, he says he's full of good lines. That guy. He says something about the number of fiddly bits, and he's the number of fiddly bits was decreased between Raptor 2 and Raptor 1.
Yeah,
and I think that's actually a really beautiful representation of the engineering efforts there, which is constantly trying to simplify.
Oh yeah,
increase the efficiency of the engines, but also simplify the design so you can manufacture it. And in general, simplification leads to better performance and testing, and everything. So the number of fiddly bits, I'm sure there's a Wikipedia page on that now as an index, is actually a really good one.
Well, and when you think about it, I don't know of any other company prior that had kind of tried to measure their performance of their engine, not in like thrust to weight ratio or like how efficient it is, like in specific impulse, but literally in like dollar to thrust ratio. Like how much does this engine cost?
Yeah.
How much thrust can it produce? And like using that as a trade study instead of just like pure metrics of, because at the end of the day, like, okay, if it's cheaper and does, X amount of work, even if it's less efficient, it can actually be better long term.
And so I guess another way, it's not even just thrust. I don't know if that metric is used, but basically the cost of getting 1 kilogram of thing up into space.
Yeah.
That's basically what they're trying to minimize.
Especially, right? Yeah.
Like,
at the end of the day, that is definitely the ultimate metric, is how much does 1 kilogram cost to orbit eventually, but it's so funny because spaceflight is just the ultimate, it's the ultimate compromise. Every little thing, any variable can just change everything else. So you can tweak so many different things to get to different numbers and conclusions, but even things like on your first stage, when the rocket's pointing straight up and the engines are pointing straight down, you're dealing more with the thrust to weight ratio of the rocket. So how much thrust is it producing versus how much is gravity pulling down on it is actually a more important metric than how raw efficient the engine is. So it's funny. Then in space, it's kind of the opposite. Thrust to weight ratio doesn't really matter. What really matters is the specific impulse, let's call it, like the nozzle escape velocity or the ejection velocity of how fast is the gas moving is like the more important number on orbit. But it's just so crazy because there's all these, like, I would just love to see the trade studies, when you're like trying to figure out, like, is this more important than this or this or this? And it's like, you change this one little thing and all of a sudden, like everything changes. It's just, even the profile, like the launch profile, the trajectory of it, everything. Everything.
I wonder what that trade-off discussions are like, because you can't really perfectly plan everything. So, and you always have to have some spare leeway on especially as you're testing new vehicles like Starship.
Yeah.
So
margins are important.
Yeah, having a margin given all the uncertainty that's there. That's really interesting, like how they do those kinds of trade-offs, because they're also rapidly designing and redesigning and re-engineering. And ultimately, you want to give yourself the freedom to constantly innovate, but then through the process of testing, you solidify the thing that can be relied upon, especially if it's a crewed mission.
Yeah.
How to do that in a rapid cycle.
I remember at some point that NASA, as they're leading up to flying humans for the first time for NASA, there's some talk that like we're going to do a design freeze because SpaceX does evolve and iterate so quickly. You know, they were saying that it was leading, because especially at the time, it was a mission called Amos 6, and they lost a rocket. They've only lost 2 rockets, like, ever, really, as far as, you know, trying to get something to space. For the Falcon 9, sorry. And the second one, Amos 6, I mean, that was back in 2016, so it's been a long time. And but at the time, you know, they were looking at flying humans in the near future. And it's like, if you guys keep tweaking this thing every time you take it out to the pad, well, there's going to be a problem, you know? And so there is some pressure from NASA to kind of slow down on that iterative process. And but that is also why they were able to evolve the Falcon 9 to be what it is today, is because they did just evolve it so quickly. Literally, like, one after another was never really the same. And we're definitely seeing that with Starship now. Like, it's evolved so quickly that you just can't even keep up with it, you know?